Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Cameron, a professor of political science at Yale and the director of the European Union Studies program at the Macmillan Center. He joins us today to discuss the ongoing Eurozone debt crisis, which began 3 years ago, shortly after a newly elected government in Greece announced that the budget deficit would be much larger than the previous government had predicted. In May of 2010, after Greece found it was unable to issue new debt to cover maturing debt and its deficit, it requested assistance from the EU and the IMF and received a 3-year loan of 110 billion euros. Yet 2.5 years later, Greece still needs assistance, and last week the Parliament approved another round of deficit reduction measures in order to receive the first installment of a second bailout, this one of 130 billion euros. Welcome, Professor Cameron.
Thank you.
So tell me, why does Greece need this second bailout?
Well, Greece needs a second bailout because the first one of 110 billion wasn't enough. Their deficit turned out to be much larger than they had anticipated because in 2010 they introduced an austerity budget, cutting the deficit, cutting spending, raising taxes. That made the economic contraction worse. Therefore, they had to do that again, and they had to do it a couple of more times. And by the spring of 2011, it was clear that they would need another 170 billion or so of help, 40 billion of which might be the remainder of the initial bailout, but that meant they would need another 130 billion or so. That was decided a year and a half ago, and we are still now going through the negotiations over this second bailout. So it is not yet completed. Greece hasn't yet received the first tranche or slice of the second bailout. It's been going on for almost 18 months, this protracted negotiation, in part because the second bailout required the private sector bondholders to take a substantial haircut, reduction in the face value of their bonds. And the so-called Troika, the EU, the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the IMF had to agree that Greece had met the terms of the second bailout. And they aren't quite there yet, and Greece is running out of money.
Okay, over the past 3 years, Greece has had to do a certain number of things, deficit reduction things. What has been the fallout from that, politically, economically?
Well, the fallout they've concentrated on cutting spending. There's been a recurring problem that Greece doesn't have enough tax revenues, and there's been enormous tax evasion. That's an issue now. They aren't.
Do you mean the public is not paying their taxes?
People have been taking euros out of the country if they could, because they feared that Greece might have to leave the Eurozone and introduce a new currency, its own currency that would depreciate in value. So people holding euros in Greece fled if they could. So a tremendous amount of money has gone. The pressure has been primarily on cutting spending, and as a result, the economy has contracted further. And meaning the GDP has dropped substantially more than was estimated initially. The unemployment rate has now gone up over 25%.
Wow.
Those under the age of 25 have an unemployment rate over 50%. And there's enormous pressure on pensions, on the elderly, on health care, and on the private sector. So it's a huge and recurring problem. Meanwhile, the debt that Greece has now has continued to increase as a share of GDP. So it's now approaching 180, 190% of GDP. And there's a likelihood it will need another additional haircut for the bondholders, many of whom now are official bondholders or official lenders.
Okay, so this has been going on for a while now, 3 years minimally. Why has it been so difficult to deal with this Greek crisis? And do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem because Greece isn't the only country that has had to get assistance. Latvia had to back in 2008. Ireland in 2010, Portugal in 2011, and the Spanish banks need assistance now, and Cyprus is about to get a loan as well. But putting aside Cyprus, of all of those, by far the most difficult case has been Greece. And I think, to tell the truth, it's a combination of the fact that the problems have existed from the outset. Greece had 100% of GDP, a debt GDP ratio of 100% when it came in, when it was admitted initially in 2001. It had a deficit way over the 3% limit that the EU has for Eurozone states from the onset of
And were
its
they
membership.
working with them from the onset to try and deal with that issue, or are they just...
Well, they were, but one of the problems is the Eurozone. There are many problems in the Eurozone and why this crisis came up. But one of the problems was the fact that the Eurozone has no real ability to limit budget deficits and the debt of the member states. They can warn them about it. They can issue stern declarations that they have an excessive deficit, but they have no effective sanctions. And they have no effective ability to limit that. As a result, Greece has been a very difficult debtor, you might say. It's had very difficult political problems in reaching agreements on all of the austerity budgets that the Eurozone and the IMF have required of it. Compare that with Ireland, for example, which has gone through the same process and is now, although it still has a high level of unemployment, it's still doing, it is doing much better. And
so why is Ireland doing so much better, yet Greece is still struggling?
Well, Ireland basically, I hate to use a trite cliche, but Ireland has taken its medicine. It figured out, it realized what it had to do, and it did it quickly, and it did it early, and it's...
What did it have to do?
Well, among other things, it recapitalized its banks. It reorganized and recapitalized its banks immediately. That's something that is still a lagging problem for Greece, and it's a problem for other countries as well, such as Spain. And it took the bitter pill of austerity, which means reductions in wages and reductions in spending. So you do get a severe economic contraction. Another example would be the 3 Baltic states, which went through a depression-sized economic contraction in 2008 and 9, and kept their currencies pegged to the euro throughout, took a very difficult economic contraction and have now pulled out and actually have relatively high rates of growth, and they're generating new jobs and they're doing better. Greece has never really gone to that point. It's resisted each step of the way, and it's partly inability to to carry out the political obligations that they make when they negotiate these bailouts. It's a problem of administrative competence of the government, I think.
Wow.
you might say Greece is a deviant case to some extent in in this crisis.
Okay, given that then, do you see a way out for Greece, a light at the end of the tunnel, anything?
Well, I think there will be eventually a recovery, but just to give you an example, there is now an argument going on between the IMF and the Eurozone over whether Greece will get its debt to GDP ratio back down to 120% by 2020.
Oh my
The
goodness.
IMF says it has to. The Eurozone is now saying, well, it probably won't. I think the conversation that's going on now is focused on the fact that sooner or later Greece will have to write off a substantial additional portion of its debt. And that'll mean that other Eurozone countries, the official lenders, will take losses.
Right.
But there's really no way out other than ultimately writing off some of that debt, because I think most people realize it's unsustainable.
So wouldn't it be better to write that debt off sooner rather than later?
It would be. It would be. Many people think it would have been smart to have done that early, but that's very difficult, of course, politically to do. But
Okay. So as you look back over the past 3 years, what do you think are the most important reasons that this crisis occurred, and what could have been done what can be done that isn't already being done to prevent it happening again?
well, I think there are a number of reasons. One reason this crisis happened is that the commitment to EMU was a political commitment. It wasn't based on economic criteria. And while there were economic criteria the countries had to satisfy in order to get into the Eurozone, low interest rate, low deficit, so forth. In fact, those criteria were loosely applied. Some of the countries that didn't meet the criteria were nevertheless let in. And the criteria didn't have anything to do with competitiveness, with the ability of a country to compete in the European single internal market without resorting to a devaluation. A second problem was what I mentioned earlier. They had no effective, and still have no strong, effective sanctions for excessive deficits, excessive debt, excessive structural imbalances. A third factor that's important, it seems to me, is that they have no means yet of regulating the financial flows that occur of banks borrowing and lending. And one of the consequences of going to the single currency, which meant, among other things, a single monetary policy run by the European Central Bank and a single central bank-controlled interest rate, was that interest rates plummeted in the countries that used to have very high interest rates pre-Euro. Most notably Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Southern Europe. That meant that it was much cheaper to borrow, and so there was a tremendous increase in borrowing, and much of that borrowing came from other European banks. And there was a tremendous flow of money into the South from northern banks and from the banks in the South as well for development projects, real estate, housing construction, so forth. All of which was completely unregulated, and we now have a situation where there's a huge amount of money sitting in the banks. The banks are owed by borrowers who cannot repay the loans, and those banks can't repay the banks from which they borrowed the money. All of that is a long-winded way of saying one thing that EMU didn't do was it didn't create a banking union, didn't create a single regulatory mechanism to oversee financial flows, borrowing and lending within the Eurozone.
Do you think that's something that they will consider doing moving forward?
Well, they are committed now. They now realize they have to do that, and they have actually committed to creating what they call a single supervisory mechanism for the financial institutions by the end of this year and have it operational as of next year. And once that's in place, then there may be a way to recapitalize the banks in Spain and elsewhere that need assistance because essentially many of the loans that they have are non-performing and will never be paid off.
Right, right. You have argued that the Eurozone will remain intact while others have said it probably will disintegrate. Do you still believe that it will stay together, or do you believe, given the situation that we see today, do you think it is possible for it to stay together?
Yes, I think it will stay together. I've made that argument in print, and I've made it actually before Mario Draghi this summer, that the president of the European Central Bank said the central bank will do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone going. And I have made that argument for a simple reason. The European states are highly dependent on trade with each other. Okay. Probably the single most important treaty in the history of the European Union was the Treaty of Rome that created a single internal market, free movement of goods, services, capital, people. As the result of that, the trade, the dependence of, or the extent to which countries depended on exports increased over time. But what increased in particular were their exports to other members of the European Union. So the countries are highly dependent on that trade. Just to give you an example, Germany, exports for Germany constitute 50% of its GDP. That's much more than in the U.S.
Right.
And 60% of those exports go to other EU states, which means that 30% of its GDP comes from exports to other EU countries. And that's true of all of the European states. Now, imagine if we in the U.S. had 50 different central banks and 50 different currencies, with our economies as highly integrated and interdependent as they are. Sooner or later, someone would say, what we need is a single central bank and a single currency.
Much simpler.
And it reduces all kinds of transaction costs and impediments to trade and the movement of goods and services and so forth. So I think that's a fundamental structural imperative that actually led the EU to propose, back when it was an EC, the European Community, back in the late 60s and 70s, proposed the creation of EMU. So I think there is a very strong impulse to move forward. The problem, though, is that they created a monetary union, but they didn't create an economic union. We have EMU without the E, economic and monetary union, but we don't have the economic union.
But what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean a high degree of coordination of economic policies so that the states are cooperating in setting their macroeconomic targets.
So they're all working on the same page, so to speak.
Yeah. And in terms of fiscal policy, it means some degree of collective authority over the budgets, over the fiscal policies of the member states. A fiscal union is a phrase that has been used very widely recently, and they are moving very slowly toward that. So that you could imagine an economic and monetary union would include not only a monetary union, but a banking union, a fiscal union, an economic union. And they're trying to create all of that, but they're doing it on the fly, you might say, in an ad hoc, post hoc way, responding to the crisis.
Right.
And in some sense, it reflects the shortcomings in the initial design you might say, design flaws of EMU as it now exists. And they recognize that, and they're moving toward it. And in fact, we'll be talking about that in the next European Council meetings. But whether
when will those be?
Well, there'll be a meeting, actually, there's one next week, and then there's one in December. The European Council of the heads of state and government of the member states. And they are looking at the possibility of a treaty at some point in the future that would move them some distance closer to that goal. But it's still a goal in the future.
How far in the future do you think?
A long way in the
Really?
future. And a long way in the future in part because a treaty requires ratification by all of the member states. And while, and that means public support in some cases. There are some countries that would, many countries actually, that would feel they had to have a referendum on a treaty that was actually creating, say, a, quote, genuine EMU, which is what is now being discussed in the European Council. And we've had previous treaties that have been defeated in referendums. The public has lost a great deal of trust in the EU as a result of this crisis. And there are further complications as well. For example, the German Constitutional Court would have to approve any treaty, and it has been, of all the actors in this crisis, the one that has most consistently argued for protecting democratic rule in the states as they move toward greater supranational control over economic, fiscal, monetary policy. And how do you create a fiscal union, a banking union, an economic union, moving those powers to the European level and still have fully democratic states controlling their budgets, doing what parliaments do?
It seems impossible.
That's a real challenge, and it's something that the Constitutional Court is very worried about.
Right. Well, more to come, clearly.
More to come.
So thank you for being here with us today and sharing some of your work around this ongoing crisis.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
For more information about Professor Cameron and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.